It's an energy conversation. And joining us in the hot seat of the Situation Room this morning is George Njenga, who is the executive chairman of the Lake Turkana Wind Power. George, good morning.
Good morning to you, Ndu.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Thank you for having me.
We're glad that you're here and have honored this invitation. There are certain things that we want to ask, and we have big expectations and big questions, but I'm sure that you have the big answers. And so let's look into some of those conversations this morning. But before we put you to task, let's put you to a smaller task. And CT, you must know, he goes around the continent every week, comes back from a different country every Monday with a new basket full of proverbs. He's in a very interesting country this week. He'll tell you where that is, and he'll also tell you the proverb. And then we would like you to interpret that for us and tell us what it means to you. Is that okay?
Let's go.
All right, then.
Yes. We are in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. Rich cultural history. Rich, as I mean, is wealthy. Caravan routes for trade that go back to the 11th and 12th centuries. But even then, there are buildings that still attest to the civilization. Now, rich in minerals. However, close to 90% of the country is actually part of the Sahara Desert, because the desert traverses several countries in that region. But the thing that we have come to understand about countries that are in what we call the Coup Belt, apart from the fact that they've had a prevalence of coups in the countries, they have minerals and they're rich in minerals. But the levels of poverty that their people have,
crazy,
jaw-breaking. Nonetheless, let's look at the proverb.
All right.
Before one cooks, one must have the meat.
Before one cooks, one must have the meat.
Yes.
You need ingredients
Okay.
to deliver.
Okay, and what do you think this means?
I think in our everyday life is that there must be a reason to be. There must be a reason to propel you. So that's the meat that propels you to cook.
Absolutely.
What is the meat that propels you to cook?
Yeah, every day when you wake up.
What is the wind that gives you power?
Exactly.
So at Lake Turkana, we needed the wind to develop the wind farm.
To get some energy,
Yep.
isn't it? So if we were to ask the question, then what's the wind that is going to propel us towards 2030? And that forms the basis for this question, that this year 2030 is, poor 2030, man. 2030 has been given so much in terms of responsibility. We're going to reach this by 2030. Certain things will be done by 2030. And one of those is that Kenya would have reached 100%, not 90%, not 80, not 75, would have reached 100% renewable energy by that year. Okay. And the question that we're asking this morning is whether that is realistic. Obviously, you sit in a position whereby you see this energy it's on a daily basis, and you see what's being created, you see what's being done. But let's start from that, where we're looking at, okay, for Kenya to get to that place where this declaration was made, what are some of the things that we saw then that was possible for us to say, okay, it's possible then by 2030 and we'll get there? And let's start there before we come back and do some definitions of when we talk about renewable energy. What on earth are we talking about anyway?
Excellent. Thank you. Once again, thank you for having me. Before I even go into your question, today is a great day, and this month is a great day for Lake Turkana, because it's our 6th anniversary since we went into commercial operation. So these are birthday months for us.
Oh, happy birthday, Lake Turkana. CT would sing, but after 9 a.m., something happens. If it were earlier in the day, perhaps you would have done that, but
now
take it all in stride.
And going back to your question, actually Kenya was here. I don't know how at least CT, the white beard, can give you away. I don't know how old the rest of us were, but in the 80s and 90s, if you recall, Kenya was actually literally 100% renewable. We had hydro, and a bit of geothermal. And it's until hydrology started challenging the country that we start having these thermal powers and so on. So the idea of being green by 2030 is actually very, very possible. It's very, very possible. It's very doable. If we think about the resource base in terms of resources for power generation in Kenya, we're very well endowed on the renewable front. Not least wind and solar and geothermal and hydro. And depending on how you combine those, achieving that is possible. I think Turkana is a perfect example of that. You can actually have large-scale renewable energy generation in Kenya, in Africa. It's the largest operating wind farm on the African continent. Very ambitious. And that same level of ambition, if you think about 2030, it's very possible that we can be fully powered. But it's more complex than that. And I guess when we go into the discussions, we'll talk about basically maybe where our energy mix is or what it is. Thanks.
Well, can we do then some definitions so that we can understand what it is that we're talking about, so that everybody is on the same page when we say that we would have reached a certain point by 2030? Then when we talk about renewable energy, what exactly are we talking about, you know?
Yeah, so renewable energy is energy derived from natural, renewable, non-climate impacting sources. In the sense, we talk about sources that do not have a carbon footprint, such as wind and solar and hydro and geothermal. So that's really what we talk about renewable energy in the context when we discuss it in a Kenyan context and given our resource base. But there are other sources such as biomass, which is also renewable because you can replant and use it for power generation. So it's a wide array of sources that make it sustainable and renewable.
So essentially it's not going to strip the environment, it's not going to destroy the environment, and you can get more and more of it.
Absolutely.
So what are the forms of renewable energy that we have?
So the foremost, of course, I'm biased, is wind.
Of course.
Right? And today Kenya has maybe upwards of 400 megawatts of installed capacity in wind. Lake Turkana being the largest of those. Then we have solar, which is basically, tapping the sun's energy to generate electricity. We have geothermal. Kenya is a continental and almost a global leader in geothermal energy, which is basically utilizing the hot resources in the earth crust.
Okay. So just on that, so essentially what we're saying is that below the surface of the earth, there are hot areas that can actually spew forth energy. That's why we see certain points in Kenya whereby, we have hot springs and things like that. That phenomenon.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And you remember when we did geography, we were told the core is very hot.
Yes.
So when water seeps to that hot area, it comes back as steam.
Yes.
And that steam is used to drive a turbine.
Yes.
And a generator, and electricity is produced.
And it can be collected and stored? Okay. All right. What else?
You know, when you talk about that, I have to ask.
Yes.
Since clearly you understand the science. These water bodies that have warm water, where we're told you can even boil an egg, how does this happen? Same principle?
It's the same principle. It's along the Rift Valley, I think.
Yes. They are in the Rift Valley, yes.
And again, we remember the Rift Valley formation was through volcanic action, which is part of that boiling heat, the fury underground. And then the water bodies then tap into that heat and they become warm. If you go to Kenyan's or Karia, they are very good hot pools, which tap on the geothermal energy. And I think it should be a big source of tourism for Kenya.
Now, when we talk about matters to do with renewable energy, we talk about projects that are resource intensive. If you talk about setting up Lake Turkana wind power project, it is resource intensive. Now that you're producing around 310.25 megawatts to the grid, we talk about how then do we scale that further to ensure that we get to the 100% mark, which begs the question, what must the government do with the stakeholders in making sure that we get there soon?
So I think you said it correctly. So one, we are very well endowed as a country. And last week I had the privilege of listening to some of the things that KPLC is doing when Dr. Engineer Sirol was actually your guest.
Yes.
And I think one of the biggest things to be done is to strengthen the transmission network. Because you see, where power is generated, oftentimes it's different from where it is consumed.
Yeah.
Because it's generated where you have the resource. So we have a fantastic wind regime around Lake Turkana area, and we'll speak about that in a moment. And the load center for Kenya, in other words, where most of the power is consumed by people, industries, institutions, is around Nairobi. So you need a transmission line between that area. And that case is the same with our hydros, with our geothermal, and so on. So strengthening that infrastructure, the evacuation network, as we call it, the collection of lines, substations, etc., is important. I think that's one of the biggest things that to be done.
Yeah.
The other thing to be done in terms of as scaling, talk about scaling is, and I think it's been big debate in Kenya about cost of electricity. We expect that as you scale, you enjoy what we call economies of scale, right? That the unit cost goes down as you become bigger. That's one. The second one is how do you fund? Right, most of these projects, because you said correctly, they're resource intensive, whether they are IPPs such as Lake Turkana or they're even, public, KenGen, etc. We source most of the funding externally. And in so doing, there's a cost of currency that, makes, the cost of electricity and therefore how fast you can scale this ambition to 2030 achievable.
Okay.
So we must start thinking more about local funding, right? Whether it's through local pension funds or SACCOs or local banks, as the case may be, to complement or to add to what our development partners help us with.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think it's many things. It's infrastructure, it's funding. One thing that Kenya has achieved remarkably is what I would call skills. Whether it's through KPLC and KenGens, there's a lot of trained manpower. If you look at some of the IPPs, usually we've gotten talent that initially worked for the utilities. So training of manpower or the human capacity has really been achieved to great levels that can help with that ambition. So I don't think we have a shortage of a skill set. And if I kind of bring you back to the scale in Turkana, you'll be impressed, I guess, to know that 99% of our workforce is Kenyan. And of that 99%, 80% is actually from Laisami's constituency, where we are based. And we are talking about big numbers. We have a total of about 304 direct employees of Lake Turkana and another almost 300 with our contractors. So when you talk about that number, 99% being Kenyan, we're talking about engineers, finance, HR, as the case may be, procurement. I think it's a great thing. Okay. So all these components, I think, make that ambition very achievable.
So, I mean, the eye is still on 2030, but, and I think I have a basic question, because then when we look at sources and their sustainability and their renewability, I need to understand what happens, that the wind power stations at Turkana are there for a reason. Why are they there? What happens around Lake Turkana that gives enough wind for then to be an entire power station set up there that would then be able to provide power around the country? What is this special thing that happens here?
So, these are natural phenomena, right? So back in 1981, two gentlemen, I think they were working for Kenya Meteorological Department, doing their usual MET studies, Jake Nuthia and Asanani. They wrote a paper about the observation that around Turkana there is this jet stream, a special wind jet stream, that also, it gets funneled through two kind of mountain ranges, the Mount Kulal and Mount Niro. They form like a funnel that makes an acceleration of the wind.
Okay.
A very special physical effect that accelerates, especially in the mornings and at nights. Abates a little bit during the day because of hot temperatures, and accelerates again. That natural physical kind of setup makes Lake Turkana actually win the best onshore wind site globally. Globally. And when I talk about globally, so there's a factor we use to measure, we let's say the goodness of the wind, strength of the wind, right? We call it capacity factor. So the capacity factor of most wind farms around the world range between 30 and maybe 48.
Okay.
Right around the world, and these are very good. Lake Turkana is above 50%.
Okay.
Right. So year to date, we are about close to 55%. There's some years that it hit 60%. So it's really good. And I'd say it's really good. That makes it possible for Lake Turkana to actually supply power very competitively.
Yeah.
When you think about cost of generation, across technologies and across sites.
Okay. This jet stream is consistent. It's an everyday thing. There's no time where the jet stream says, well, I'm going to take a break today. So it is constant and it's moving all the time, right? I'm asking these questions in this manner because we listen to these conversations all the time, but I can bet you that half the time we don't know exactly what's going on. So we've seen the pictures of the large windmills or turbines that are moving. Explain to us what happens where we have the natural occurring phenomenon of the jet stream of wind between these two mountain ranges and the turbines that we see. What are they doing to capture this energy, and how does that now translate to the lights going on, for example?
Good. So one is consistent act of God.
Okay.
So let's call it that way for the time being, right?
Yeah.
And while consistent act of God, it has variability, right? So it still varies. We have what we call an energy curve throughout the year where we monitor how it behaves. Some months are stronger than others. During the rainy season, we have our lowest winds. So we are going to what is our low wind season as we go into the long rain season, okay? So that kind of, there is an inverse relationship between raining and blowing, okay?
Yeah.
So the turbine is really, I would say, a mechanical device that captures the wind using your and turns. When we were small boys, I grew up near a farm
and girls
around a farm, and the boys did this game more. The girls were playing kati, but what the boys were doing when the girls were playing kati, they would take dry maize stalks, and poke in the center with a stick.
Yes.
And run
with it,
wind.
and it would propel.
And because the maize stalk leaf is somehow curved, it's able to capture the wind and propel. CT, I don't know that you did that in the village.
actually played this game, and I'm a girl. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm speaking to brethren here, right?
I did it, and I'm saying I did it, and I'm a girl. So hey, but anyway,
there you go, right?
Yes.
And so we did this. That's exactly what the wind farm does. But you're doing it at a large scale. Okay. So that turning action, you don't have to run against the wind.
Yeah.
The reason we were running against the wind was to actually generate the wind. Okay, now the wind is a jet stream that comes through, so it finds you static. It's the same blade. It turns. And the shaft then is tied to a small thing called an alternator that actually generates power.
Okay.
Right? Inside that, you've seen the column. So you have the big wings, right? They look like aircraft wings, right?
Yes, they do.
Same principle.
They look like huge aircraft wings, yes.
So down the tower, we have a small transformer, right? Transformer is the one which now takes that and kind of takes it to a certain voltage, stabilizes it.
Is it step up or step down?
Well, this is just a collector transformer, right? And then it steps up to take it up to a substation, right? So we have 365 turbines, individual turbines.
Right there.
Okay. They are all connected with a network of cables. And all these cables lead up to a substation where each power is brought. It's like Harambe, it's a big basket and everybody's bringing their thing, right? Then you have a big basket. That is the power we take to Ketrako, and then Ketrako moves it.
Okay.
438 kilometers to Suswa, where we have a much larger substation, that's a national substation, and onwards to consumers.
This is fascinating stuff. So now, the thing about this is that this power is produced on site, right here at Lake Turkana, at that area. And then what now moves is the distribution mechanism. That's what now moves. So before we go to the break, tell us how much power of which is being consumed today comes from wind?
Very good question. Actually, on good days, we generate up to 15% of the entire power consumed in the country. On average, year to date, so the grid in Kenya is about 3,200 megawatts, right? So in terms of just installed capacity, 310 versus 3,000 is about 10%. But quite frankly, sometimes, what is really used on the grid, I think Cyril talked about peak demand.
Yes.
Maybe 2,200 or thereabout, 2,300. So when we generate up to 280 megawatt, we actually generate upwards of 15% of the Kenya grid.
George Njenga is the executive chairman, Lake Turkana Wind Power, and we're looking at Kenya's ambition towards 100% renewable energy by 2030 and asking ourselves the question whether it is a realistic goal, whether it is a realistic ambition. Just in case we didn't know, we're in 2025, so there's 5 years to go. We've talked about the fact that this has been here forever, and what would have formed the decision to make that goal, to say that we can do this? Usually, I hope that decisions are based on information, data collected over time. That with what you've described to us so far and so brilliantly well, George, what informed to say that actually we can make sure that we can depend on this power and that you can have it 100%, that Kenya will be using renewable power, which is safer for the environment, it lasts longer, all of these things, by 2030?
Look, I think one of the things that I must, and we all must credit the government, is just the vision around, we can't keep talking about global warming and the disasters of climate change without taking action. And beyond taking action is kind of taking an inventory of what do you have. And as I said before, we've been there before. We had literally 100% dependency on green energy. We can argue about whether it was adequate, right? And I think we went through periods of because of climate change, weather challenges that challenged our hydrology, and our hydropower was insufficient, and we went through load shedding. I think it had a big economic impact. I think it's this idea that we need to transform our economy. We need to transform our economy means we need lots of power, and that power needs to be sustainable. And then you walk backwards and say, do we have the resource base to do it? And the answer is yes, we have the resource base. The other thing I think which must also have been clear in the minds of policymakers is where has technology come? Back in the day, wind power and solar power were actually very expensive. Because of the intermittent nature, it was challenging to bring them to the grid, as it were, right? Because it blows now, it doesn't blow, it shines now, there's a cloud cover. But there's enough convergence of technology now to make renewable power possible. And because this is indigenous to us, the idea of losing forex through importation of fossil fuels to meet your power demand, I think must have made some economic sense. So for Kenya, it's actually beyond just climate change. It's just the economically sensible decision to make. And I think the context of 2030 then was the vision 2030. That time it looked like it's a long time ago. And as you've reminded us several times here and it's actually 5 years away, right? But it's actually very possible. I feel, right from the climate summit that happened in Nairobi the other year, I feel the sense of urgency. And I see, right from the new rules you've seen the regulator publish. EPRA published some interesting kind of rules to further open up the space for investment, to go beyond the few actors, right, to ensure that more can generate. Actually, private can transmit as well. We've also seen the success of PPPs coming in to I would say, supplement public financed projects. All these things are happening, and the regulatory framework is there. There's nothing literally to stop this country from achieving that goal even sooner, to be honest. I think today the only major role other sources play is what I call insurance. So if you think about what you call the power ecosystem, we have power plants that we call baseload, meaning they provide power continuously, okay? Geothermal, hydro, we call them baseload. We have others we call intermittent, like wind and solar, because they're intermittent. And the others we call insurance policy. Right. So and just like insurance, you can pay your medical cover, but you don't get sick. I don't think you say it was too expensive to have insurance. So you still have a bit right now, some thermal sources that provide insurance to the grid. Because we'll all agree the most expensive power is no power, right? The next most expensive power is unreliable power. So when you think about it in that framework, and you need to think about it, a studio like this, I'm sure you have several sources of power, otherwise it would be going off every so often if a tree fell on the grid lines. Maybe you have some solar panels here, I'm told, right? You do?
We do.
There you go. You do that for insurance, okay? So 2030 becomes possible because technology today allows you to actually store power from intermittent sources, right? And with a number of things are converging. So electric vehicle, electric mobility, as well as energy storage in power systems are all driving a critical mass from a technology standpoint of the storage technology, okay? Whether it's batteries, etc. So that the cost of storage is becoming cheaper. So you can blow, right, when you don't need power and store it in a battery. And when you need power and it's not blowing, the battery still has your stock of power with you. So all these are converging. So this makes it possible that by 2030, you actually can be 100% green.
And are these things being done in Kenya right now?
Absolutely. I mean, they're being done at varying degrees. I think the Ministry of Energy, who is a policy driver for the sector, has made it clear that, and is part of the regulations now, that any renewable project going forward will have to be packaged together with storage. So if you're going to do solar or wind, you also need some storage capacity. And that allows you to do a few things. So for example, in the mornings and in the evenings is when we call peak demand. When we all wake up and put on our gadgets to make breakfast, to do whatever we do in the morning, or in the evening when we come back home and all lights are on, what you find is there's a spike of demand, right, of electricity. That period lasts for about 2 to 3 hours. Today, that period is met with some of our thermal generation, right? As energy storage becomes mature, in future, that will be very well met using what you stored that you didn't use during the day. And that's how this thing works.
So these batteries can last, depending on what they are. The lifespan is interesting, but for how long can they store this power?
So it depends on how much you are discharging. But there are systems of 2 hours, there are systems of 4 hours, right? And there are systems for longer. And as you say, it's an emerging technology. So there's a continuous improvement.
There is.
Right? And, some areas you can actually, if you're only using it for lighting purposes and you use LED, which is low consumption, you can have a full system for 24 hours.
So let's talk about what Turkana wind power has done to the environment, and that is offsetting around 736 tons of CO2. And when you talk about that, then brings the entire conversation on which would be carbon trading, and the entire conversation on how the government is also pushing that in making sure that as much as we are getting rid of what you are doing in cleaning the environment, that the resource, the monies that we get from carbon offsetting goes back to you to be able to improve on the technology and equally being able to produce more for the grid. So are we having such conversations? Because we talk about carbon trading in terms of those from the West coming here, buying land, planting trees and whatnot, but there is what you're doing already that is helping clean the environment. So are those conversations happening?
No, absolutely. Actually, the way the wind farms work is because of the avoided CO2,
yes,
right? So you can actually register, and Lake Turkana is registered, right, for carbon offset. And the way the contract was done is all the carbon credit to the project, when realized, are passed to the communities along the transmission line who are affected by, let's say, displacement, etc., on the transmission line through KPLC and the National Treasury. So actually, so that's how it's registered, right? So the economics of the project actually sufficient, but carbon credit go to actually impact positively to the community, and that's another dimension of Lake Turkana as a project that you should actually think about. Because beyond carbon credit and what it should do for the community, the project since inception, we spent just under $1 billion shillings in community activities. And, I've been with Lake Turkana now for about 5 months. And in November, when I joined, I've been very deliberate just to go and take stock of the community effect that this project has in the area. And it's phenomenal. Because you actually see, it's not just a number. The amount spent is actually not just a number. It's when you go and see the dormitories, the hospitals, the maternity and the wards in hospitals, the water projects, whether it's boreholes or reverse osmosis plants because some of the water is quite saline. It's phenomenal. We've done over 100 individual projects, and they are going on as we speak, and it's really amazing. You see the effect of these funds in the community. When you go and say, last year we did a major, kind of eye camp, eye clinic for local people. Right now we have some vaccinations going on that are fully sponsored by the project. Through we have an NGO called Winds of Change, which fully funded just to have community impact. It's a positive thing. So beyond the electrons that we produce and generate and send to the national grid for economic development, the impact on the ground, human impact, is actually. And I tell people quite frankly, the reason I joined Lake Turkana, this stood tallest among other reasons just to see the impact of this. And then you use this example and say, how can we use infrastructure development to accelerate our own economic development as a country and improve outcomes for citizens? This is a fantastic example, and actually I would invite all of you to when you are available to come and just see firsthand the impact of this project to the community.
Lake Turkana wind power is based in Marsabit.
Yes.
The other wind power entities in the country.
Yes.
Now, and the other people who have actually indicated an interest in developing and creating. 15% was the figure you gave in relation to the contribution that wind power makes to the national grid. If we were to aim for 50%, what would we need to do as a country?
So I think 15, but let me just make a quick clear update. 15% is Lake Turkana, right? When you think about the other large wind farm is Kipeto, 100 megawatts. And by the way, I was the founder chairman of Kipeto, so I've been involved in the wind for some time. And Kengen also has a 25 megawatts wind farm in Ngong area.
Ngong, yes.
So collectively, wind is about 20%, right, of power generated. So you talk about there are a number of things, right? Wind still is variable; it varies. it's intermittent,
Yes.
right? So maybe I don't think you talk about wind being 50% of the grid, because maybe then you need a very strong base load, right, to ensure that the energy is stable, right? It's quite complex. I think when you speak with KPLC and the team at the National Control Center, they'll actually tell you it's quite complex integrating all these sources and give you stable power on the other side. So I think you can take it, you can push it beyond where we are, and it will continue to make what I would call a reasonable contribution to the grid. But I don't think with all the other sources you have that it will go to 50%. Geothermal is still there, and sun is still there.
Okay.
Yeah.
The two gentlemen who came across this phenomenon, of jet power, what were they doing in that part of the world?
So look, I don't know what they were doing, but
I'm going somewhere with this. You see, I'm asking the question of, have we looked at possibilities of actually having within the country resources that can do what the Lake Turkana wind power is doing? That's really what I'm asking. When I talk of 50%, I'm talking about the possibility of building capacity beyond the 20% and even beyond that. Why? Is there any harm if we have a surplus? Is there any harm if we have a situation where, for instance, we know that because of the 50% that I'm talking of, one is actually able to, should we say, reduce the reliance for the time when we have the wind, whether it's in the morning or the evening.
Yeah.
I'm simply talking about making renewable energy, giving it a greater contribution to what we call not just the production, but the consumption of power in the
Making
country.
it the first point use.
That's
for
what I'm
example?
talking about,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean,
No,
if
I'm with you, City. So the guys who discovered this phenomena, right, or who observed it, let's say who observed it back in '81, there were more scientists from meteorological department. So as you know, Met has various stations where they measure all these
All over the country.
weather activities, right? So in that process, they they reported it. But it's not until 2005 when two actually Dutch, I think they were tourists, Willem Dolman and Okello, while touring that area, and I think they had a third gentleman, who I forget the name, when touring that area, they observed this
Same
yet
thing.
again. And if you remember, when back in geography, Netherlands is very renowned for its
windmills,
right?
yes.
We saw those
Oh,
wooden
yes.
windmills,
Yes,
right,
yes.
back in the day. So it's something they were familiar with. So they are the ones who actually conceptualized the idea of a wind farm. So they embarked on studies. So if you think about 2005 and 2025, so this is 20 years later, right? And one thing led to another, and in 2014 there was a power purchase agreement, right, negotiated on the back of that. But going to your question is, how much do we leverage what I would say scientific observations? And we have plenty of that. I think if you go to government departments, there's a wealth of knowledge. When we developed a different wind farm I mentioned before, we relied a lot on meteorological data in Dagoretti, and it's available to the public, and we could see what you say, almost 20-30 year data, and then you go beyond that. Now the Ministry of Energy, I think around 2009 and thereabout, they actually established a wind map, right? So they actually did a project. So the government, sometimes we don't give government enough credit, but I think they do a lot of stuff. It's how we convert that stuff to,
Actuality.
actionable projects that drive the economy. But they invest a lot of that. So they developed a wind atlas that shows what are the pockets in our country that there's a good wind resource, right? So that exists. So it's more of not talking about the other ingredients. Now that the knowledge is there, and the pioneering projects such as Lake Turkana had to do that for themselves. So they are beyond the observation of the scientists. They are to do the actual measurement to actually see over time you can invest, because it's a massive investment. So you can't invest, then the wind just disappears, because then you'll have a dead project. So it's more of, again, science and capital, right, and entrepreneurship coming together to make things happen.
Look, George, I mean, I'm one of those who says that we actually don't give enough to the strides that have been made in terms of development. And when we look at the power, we know that power drives industry, and then from there we know that it drives economies. What you should do after that, of course, is when we talk about implementation metrics, which we seem to suffer from a lot. When we look around the continent, right, if we look at West Africa, there's a power problem, a big power problem in terms of what is able to be generated, what is able to be stored and then used for output. We can see the same thing happening in South Africa. When we look at load shedding, just as some of the things that you talked about, in terms of what is able to power industry, in terms of what is needed vis-a-vis what is being produced, again, problems there. If we look at the central belt of the continent, again, the same problems. We look at some of the countries that make up the COMESA SADC area, they have power cuts through the day. These are some of the things that we are talking. These are the realities of the day. So Kenya is sitting pretty in East Africa and having this humongous achievement, because let's be honest, with what's happening with power now, when we're looking at the percentages that Kenya has reached, it is phenomenal. And when we look at the position that Kenya is on the globe, not in Africa, on the globe, in terms of the production of power, this is a big deal. So for me, why all the more necessary it is for the practitioners to take it seriously and say, 2030, 5 years away from now, what is remaining to be done to achieve that? And perhaps it can be 2027. Perhaps it can be 2028. 2030 sounds nice. That's great. But are we actually seeing a place whereby Kenya could easily be the first country to say that it is depending 100% on renewable energy and is serving as the poster child for what other countries must do?
So, thank you. I like the way you've taken us around the continent, because I just felt like you describing my own life. So I've had the privilege to work in West Africa, out of Nigeria, Cameroon, in South Africa. I've done power projects in Angola, in Mozambique, etc., Tanzania. And actually, Africa is very endowed, right, with resources.
Absolutely.
To generate power. I think we have to be more serious. And that's the only thing I say. I mean, we just have to be more serious, because we have the resources, we have the human capacity. But I think we just need to get to work. All right. But having said that, I think, and I know something we're a bit cynical about our achievements. Kenya actually has done well. Today, I think Kenya has maybe an electrification rate of upwards of 75%.
76, actually.
Right? And that's among the best in Africa. We are starting now to rival countries that were in that before us, such as South Africa, right? So it can be done, right? It can be done. And I think things get done when there's convergence, right? I think today the biggest convergence, or the biggest, I would say, catalyst to make things happen is actually the young generation. I'm very excited about the young people. One, they are the major demographic of our population, right? And they need more. They need to consume stuff. They need to wear clothes, to feed,
drive electric cars.
They need to be engaged. And it takes electricity to modernize an economy. It takes electricity to drive industry, to drive food security through storage, etc. So electricity is really at the core. And with this catalyst called, and they're very impatient. You've seen they push us at every side. I have young guys in my own house. They're out of the nest now. But I see the impatience with the older folks, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the driving force that we should take advantage of to focus ourselves, to get to work. Because, as I say, we need to get to work. So, look, the other convergence that needs to be, because we're on the same mission, is between what I call private capital through, in this case, independent power producers and public utilities. We're on the same mission, right? Our mission is to power socioeconomic development. Our mission is to improve outcomes for citizens by providing clean, affordable, and reliable power. And then you let the other people do their stuff. Because I can tell you, I listen to KEPSA, I listen to Kenya's manufacturers, because they benchmark their energy costs with other countries where maybe they compete with. If you're talking about COMESA or even the intra-Africa, if you have to be competitive, your inputs must be competitive, and electricity is one of those. But they also have to be sustainable. Very soon, the markets will not participate if you have a CO2 footprint in your end product.
Yes.
So this agenda for 2030 green is also economic. It's also competitiveness in terms of access to markets in future. And there is no bigger, I would say, driver for all of us than just knowing that and acting with urgency.
Indeed. 2030 is not too far away. It's just, I say it again, it's just 5 years away. And we'd love to be on the sidelines, cheering it on and saying, absolutely, let this be, one of the many things that Kenya can actually do and serve. Look, I always say development begets development. You have a ripple effect in other parts of the continent as well. So, it deserves a well done, and it deserves an egging on to say, let's get to work and do what needs to be done. George Njenga is the executive chairman of Lake Turkana Wind Power. He's been our guest this hour, pointing us in the direction of 100% renewable energy by 2030. Let's see how it goes. Thank you for being here this morning. Asante sana.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.